Welcome to Poor Millionaires. Today's guest is Swen Lorenz. Sven is CEO at Sarnia Asset Management and the author of the website Undervalued Shares. Sven is on location in Kiev and will be discussing Ukraine as a potential land of opportunity for entrepreneurs and investors. Poor Millionaires is the show for people with investable wealth of $1 to $20 million. We strive to educate, connect and inspire, to give you the tools you need to thrive and secure lasting prosperity for yourself and for your family. PoorMillionaires.com. Invest with ambition. This podcast is for educational purposes only. The information does not constitute financial advice or recommendation and should not be considered as such. Value of investments and any income derived from them can fall as well as rise, and you may not get back the original amount you invested. Swen Lorenz, welcome back to the show.
Hi James, it's great to be here, and I guess today with a slightly experimental piece of content.
Absolutely. So yeah, we're here to talk about Ukraine as a land of opportunity. Which might seem a little bit strange to some people. So can you just give us a bit of an insight into what the rationale was behind the inception of this episode?
I mean, first of all, I think we should ask our viewers to forgive us for choosing a slightly controversial and clickbaity title, but we do actually mean it like that as well. But in these days of, I guess, political polarization, you do need to say that, obviously what's happening in Ukraine is terrible. And that notwithstanding, there are opportunities here for investing, for building businesses, even for becoming a resident, possibly after the war is over. And lots of people are looking at that. I detect great interest in the subject matter. So I think this conversation is actually going to do really well on YouTube, but I think we'll also get a few nasty comments, and that's just something we have to live with.
So we're all about looking for opportunities where nobody else is kind of prepared to look. And with Ukraine, you're talking about things like, a rise in entrepreneurship. And government's giving you kind of like the freedom to go out there and do what you want to do to build a business. It's not necessarily the kind of thing that would associate with Ukraine, given that, the first things that jump to mind are, obviously it's involved in a war at the moment. Ukrainian oligarchs not necessarily got the best reputation. It's got a lot of corruption. So what's going on here? Like, what's the rationale behind this?
So I guess we need to mention I am in Ukraine actually right now. I'm in the apartment that I always rent when I'm in Kiev, which is the third time this year. And the first time going here in April, I don't want to say I was scared, but I had huge respect, because going to a country that is in a hot war is no matter you should take too lightheartedly. At the same time, I found so many surprising aspects of the circumstances of the country, and I met an incredible number of interesting people whose personal journey doesn't necessarily fit the narrative that we have been used to through mainstream media. And to cut to the chase, this very much includes people I've met who were Ukrainian, who fled to the West when the war broke out, and who lived in some of the great Western cities where you could go as a refugee and rebuild your life, but they chose to come back and bring their families back, their children. And I'm quoting one of them. He said, "I have more opportunity in Ukraine." And I guess there's a whole range of things we need to unpack and speak about. And the first one is, and this sounds quite negative, and we're obviously veering into the hyper-polarized area of politics, but a lot of people are just simply disillusioned by Western countries in terms of overregulation, high taxation, anti-entrepreneurship. Lack of safety becomes an issue in quite a few major cities now. And then you've got young people who are, some of them actually quite affluent, are telling me, I've come back to Ukraine because the education system is better for my child. My wife is safe in Kiev or in Lviv. These are the cities where you can live a life largely, I'm not saying entirely, but largely removed from the fighting. And there is entrepreneurial freedom, and it's a society that is probably 10 or 20 or 30 years behind in some ways. But given what's happening in Western Europe, that may be an advantage in some ways. And for example, you face a certain amount of red tape here if you want to set up a business, but I found some of the business regulation here quite friendly. So, for example, you can choose between two different tax systems. The tax rates overall are not that high, and we can talk about that, in a bit more detail. But bringing it all together, there are a lot of opportunities in Ukraine for anyone who wants to build a business, who wants to have a career, which can also be in IT. Before the war, the IT industry was the second largest export industry in this country. And there's probably less competition here because, yes, millions of people have left, and that reduces competition. And with that in mind, it's certainly a country of opportunity for some. I've met these people, so I'm just repeating what they've told me. This is not me making this up.
So you're currently sat there in Kiev right now, yeah? And I think most people would imagine that you'd be sort of dodging bullets and the like, but it's not like that at all, is it? I mean, I've seen the pictures, I've seen the videos that you've sent back. Everything looks very civilized. Just give us a bit of an impression as to what things are like on the ground right now.
So it's almost mind-boggling how normal the situation here feels most of the time. For most people, there's always exceptions. We have to be careful how we phrase things. But Kiev is a highly functioning city. It is about 300 kilometers from the front line. It needs to be kept in mind the Ukraine is a country that's, I believe it's slightly bigger than France. It's absolutely massive. And the fighting is mostly in the eastern part. And then, yes, Kiev, for example, does get attacked by drones. That's what always comes up in the media. It also has a very effective, what's it called, an aerial shield. And it's not at the center of fighting. And I did see a headline once, a couple of months ago, where a Ukrainian politician invited a Western politician saying, come to see the ruins of Kiev, something like that. And every image we see of Kiev is always a destroyed building. And yes, that does happen. But on the whole, it's a city where fighting isn't going on in the sense that you'd imagine it's going on. And it's far away. And then there's also, for example, Lviv, which is the city that's even further to the west, which has seen massive influx of people who wanted to get away from the hot war. So I'm not dodging bullets here. Occasionally the air siren, the air alarm goes off, and then most people actually ignore it, rightly or wrongly. After 3 years, all of these things have become a bit of a surreal normality, which people have adjusted to in their own ways. And I spent a week here in April, a week in August, and now I'm here for 2 weeks. And you will not believe this, and I'm never quite sure whether I should actually say this, but to this day, I've not seen a damaged building. And I've been around Kiev a fair bit. I haven't been to the suburbs, which is where most of the bad stuff happens. But in the center of Kiev, the worst I've experienced so far was a water outage.
Right, so life goes on in much of Ukraine, but you mentioned to me that the growth in the the number of millionaires, which was pretty astounding. I think the figure was up 58% in just 1 year. So what's going on there?
Yes, so this was a media report that circulated, including in the English-speaking world, and I missed it at the time when it came out, but a friend from Dubai pointed it out to me, and then I looked it up, and it's one of those headlines that's also designed to get people's interest. So it was the number of millionaires is up 1.5 times in Ukraine last year alone. And then when you look closer, and I pulled up technically speaking, for a start, this is sort of an accurate statement. But you need to qualify it and interpret it and adjust it somewhat, because I then went to the website of the tax services here in Ukraine, the government website, and pulled up the press release based on which this news story was created. And the tax office press release said that this refers to income millionaires in the local currency. And so this basically translates to anyone who has an annual income of $24,000, which of course is not that much. But, and this is where it gets interesting. So digging through this press release and seeing all the other interesting facts and updates the inland revenue here published, I noted, for example, that there's one taxpayer in Kiev, no one knows who he is, although maybe locals can guess who it might be. There's one taxpayer who last year paid taxes of $110 million. And what this tells me is that much as this is a country that is in some ways developing and has an issue with corruption, if it was that easy to bribe your way out of all sorts of situations, I don't think that person would have paid $110 million in taxes last year. It's also notable that not everyone has moved to, Monaco, Cyprus, and Dubai and all the usual havens. And the other thing that I found possibly the most interesting piece of intel from this press release was that ultimately this may not actually be the number of people increasing who have a high income, but the number of people increasing who have a high income and report it properly to the tax authorities. Ukraine is doing quite well in terms of digitizing its government. One of those stories that just doesn't get reported about. And as part of the digitization of government, it becomes harder to evade taxes, to pay bribes, and do all sorts of dodgy stuff. So this may not actually be all that much income of people going up. It may just simply be the tax system is becoming more effective and tax evasion and everything associated with it is going down. So very interesting story. And I'm very sure that some people in this country are doing well economically. Not the least since, as cynics would always say, war is good business for some people. But yeah, on the whole, it's an expression of some of the underlying changes in this country when it comes to tax collection, and notwithstanding also some growth, obviously.
So the point about digitization is an interesting one, isn't it? Because we're all very familiar with the shortcomings in this regard when it comes to the UK, for example, and the EU and their digital infrastructure. There's a lot to be, there's a lot of problems, I think, with the infrastructure in these places. So how does the Ukraine differ in that regard? What makes the Ukraine stand out to you?
So Ukraine seems to be a very digitized country. I don't have a single metric to pull out that would explain the entire picture, and I'm not the world's leading expert on the subject matter, but I walk through here with my eyes and ears open, and it is notable how many services here, banking, government, public services are run through mobile phones. It's all working. Before the war, the IT services industry was the country's second largest export industry. Ukraine has always been known as a country where you have a highly educated workforce and many of them working in IT. I think this is something that's reflected in this ongoing digitization of the country. Then you can add to it now that Western countries are exerting quite some pressure on the government to modernize and to make things more transparent and reliable, all of which reduces corruption as well. And I guess it really helps also, if as a country you build everything from scratch, and Ukraine was very much lagging behind for many, many years, but then eventually they got going on this, and probably at the right time when technology was available. So on the whole, and you see from our stable internet connection, I think this country is doing quite well in terms of digitization, and that may be one of the stories that gets a lot more attention when finally this war is over. I don't know when it will be over, but every war is over eventually. And then, I hope many entrepreneurs, tourists, visitors, business people will focus on all the strengths of Ukraine again. And there are quite a few of them.
So you mentioned, obviously, that the digitization feeds into the whole anti-corruption agenda. And if we look at the Ukraine on sort of international measures, it scored 35 out of 100 on the Corruption Perception Index. It ranks 105 out of 180 countries for the level of corruption, according to Transparency International. So obviously, corruption is a big issue for Ukraine, and it's right in the forefront of our minds when we think of a country like Ukraine. So how would you characterize the situation at the moment?
I think to characterize the situation, it's worth going back 25, 30, 35 years. So in the 1990s, there was a widely quoted and quite famous report from Deutsche Bank that stated very confidently that among all the countries of the former Soviet Union, Ukraine has the highest potential and is probably going to do the best. And it turned out the opposite was the case. They were forever the laggard, and corruption was a major issue there and has repeatedly really haunted the country. Again, I'm not the foremost subject expert matter, but it appears that corruption played a major role in the bank collapses here, the bank defaults in the 2010s. And I think at one point the banking system here, or the Ukrainian banks, the domestic banks, had a defaulted loan rate of, I think it was 30%, but it could have been 50%. It was insanely high in any case. And there were issues with oligarchs having robbed banks, for lack of a better word, not robbed physically, but in a sort of like in a business kind of way. And the perception created by all of these instances of corruptions and the long-standing negative ranking of Ukraine in these ranking tables is certainly following the country and will follow it for much longer. It always takes a generation to shake off a reputation. I mean, as you know, some people, if you speak about Colombia, for example, some people still ask you about Pablo Escobar, and he died in the 1980s. So, it takes a long time for public perception to change, but on the ground, things are already changing for real. And as part of what I'm doing here, I've met up with some of the largest law firms of the country, and it boils down to, yes, corruption is an issue, but it is less of an issue with every year that passes. And I think there are a couple of factors coming together here. Pressure from the West, modernize, clean up your act. If you're getting all this money and support from the West, then, please behave reasonably well. And I think I detect something like call it a sense of national cohesion and a desire by the local population to not see their sons and their daughters who are dying in the war wasted on a country that is getting plundered by a corrupt elite. Ordinary Ukrainians you speak to, want things to improve. And I think this is now trickling through the system and is gradually improving matters. So it's worse in some business sectors than others. I mean, try opening a nightclub in London, and you'll see who you get exposed to in terms of corruption and crime. And there are certain industries and sectors that have always been more prone to corruption, and others that are less exposed to corruption. So if you want to do business in Ukraine, you also choose your destiny to a certain extent. You have to be well informed and know what you're doing.
So if I'm an investor or an entrepreneur, I'm looking to take advantage of the opportunities that are on offer in Ukraine. Give us some examples of these opportunities. I mean, you mentioned the IT sector, but what other ones would you highlight?
I think the biggest one, and the one that is the easiest to enter, and which probably has 20 years to run, is real estate, property. So I know many property entrepreneurs who got wealthy in Western Europe, Germany in particular, and the UK over the last 20-25 years by buying properties, doing them up, improving them, renting them out, flipping them, all the usual things. And now in the combination of higher interest rates, markets are more matured, prices have reached a certain level, and overregulation by government, that is just simply not a business anymore. And I've had German entrepreneurs who made money in real estate reach out to me and say, there's just nothing in my home country I can do anymore because everything is regulated to death, and the cost of regulation and just the sheer brain damage you're suffering when you work in that sector has become suffocating. And then it's sort of almost the opposite here in Ukraine. And I'm not sure if you can see this here if I move my video screen a little to the right. This is the guaranteed to be not health and safety compliant ladder or steps up to where my bed is here in my lovely Airbnb that I'm renting every time because I like it so much. And then above that, it's all an accident waiting to happen. This would pass no health and safety inspection. But this is normality, and I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying that here the government is less involved. If you buy a property, then if you do stuff internally, there's hardly anything you need to do in terms of permits. If you want to restore a facade of a historical building, totally different story, of course. But you have very high rental yields here, ranging anywhere from 8% to 22%, depending on what you're looking at. You have a huge gap between refurbished, renovated, and old properties in residential and in office. And that's very much down to just the sheer lack of capital because the banks all went bust. So there are no mortgages here. There's just no lending. There's no external money coming in. So yes, the domestic, the local population is investing their own money into real estate here, but that's just not really, moving the needle to such an extent. If I was a real estate entrepreneur, I'd come here and deploy significant amounts of cash and improve buildings. Refurbishing is really where you create value, and you refurbish something and it's suddenly worth 30% or 50% more. And that's not rocket science, and that's worked for many years in many other countries. And I think this is going to be the golden opportunity here in Ukraine. And that's before we're even speaking about war damage, housing shortage, structural housing shortage, because there was just never that much space per capita. It's an extraordinarily interesting situation, and one day there'll be peace here, and one day there'll be financing again, and there'll be mortgages. And I think this is a 5-year, 10-year, and 20-year opportunity that will just keep running. And, all I can say is, young man, don't go west, go east. I would certainly look at property opportunities here. And that's what I'm doing. I'm looking at a real estate fund for Kiev. Subject we can cover in another conversation. But it's very indicative, and I think a good example of the kind of opportunities you have here. And that's why we did actually choose the title of this video to be what it is, no matter what reaction we're getting from the audience.
What about the tax situation then? Because we all know, obviously, the tax in Western Europe is now at levels that is basically suffocating entrepreneurship. What's it like in Ukraine?
It's a lot lower, basically. And the nice thing is you can choose between two tax systems. There's the so-called simplified tax system, and the name says it all. You simply pay a percentage of your revenue, which obviously as a small business makes your life a lot easier. And I'd say let's dig into the details of the various options here, maybe even in a separate video, because that might be interesting for some people. And, taxes is always something, even if it's a simple system, you should cover it in a bit of detail. But the bottom line is you keep a much higher percentage of what you're generating if you're operating here in Ukraine. And if you're a foreign investor, Ukraine has double taxation treaties with a variety of countries. So, almost anywhere is better nowadays than Western Europe, and that includes developing countries, which is extraordinary, but that's sadly the truth that that we live with now.
Sure is. So what have you got planned for the upcoming days in Ukraine then, Sven?
So I'm here for 2 weeks, and I, among other things, I'm a firm believer that tourism in Kiev will go through the roof once there is peace and it's safe, like completely safe and normal to visit again. And most importantly, you can take an airplane here, which right now you can't. You have to travel by bus or train. I always take a train from Warsaw, and that takes 16 hours, which is just, not very practical. So I am exploring some tourist sites. I am looking at real estate here and meeting with all sorts of people in different industry. I'm learning about the startup sector as well. There's a huge sector for defense tech startups. And, maybe like Israel, this can become a nation that out of a very unfortunate situation grows an extraordinarily interesting or extraordinarily profitable and large industry. Israel is now the world's 7th largest exporter of weapons. And maybe Ukraine has a golden future with, its know-how and its experience in, for example, drone technology. So I'm learning a lot. I'm meeting with locals in between. I'm going to lovely restaurants. All I can say is the restaurant scene here in Kiev is out of this world. Service is amazing. Interesting people. Just about everyone speaks English. I live in a modern apartment. I'm just in the city center. I'm a little bit of a tourist. I'm a business visitor at the same time. And I'm a, curious person who likes to learn about the world by actually going to places, which is why we had this conversation to pass on some of my observations as a bit of an let's say a narrative that offers to complete some of the gaps that others have been missing.
Yeah, it's interesting to challenge the whole narrative on Ukraine, and I think people's perceptions that they've got from the mainstream media are not necessarily accurate. But keep dodging those bullets, Sven, or not, as the case may be. And I'm sure we'll have you on again soon. Thanks again to Sven for his time today. If you enjoyed the pod, don't forget to hit the follow and the like button. And thanks for listening, everyone.